We're going to go ahead and get started. Mike, are you able to hear me?
I hear you loud and clear, Daniel.
Fantastic. So yeah, we're going to jump right into it. Thank you for everyone for joining. I'm glad you're here. My name is Daniel Johnson. I'm the Chief Operations Officer here at the Venza Group, and this is our April installment of the Hospitality Webinar Series. So we're very glad to be kicking it off. There's a lot of talk about PCI 3.0, and so it's definitely a timely subject. And we've got the very knowledgeable person here speaking on the subject from the law firm of Arnold Gold & Gregory, a partner, an attorney at AGG. Mike Burke is going to be presenting the topic, 3.0, a look ahead, PCI 3.0, a look ahead. Mike has presented for us in the past, and for those that are unfamiliar with AGG, they are a national law firm. Mike, you're in D.C. currently?
Yes, I'm a partner in the D.C. office.
Fantastic. And Arnold Gold & Gregory is near and dear to the Venza Group. They are our PCI compliance content partner for our PCI compliance for hoteliers learning programs. So that's a little bit about AGG. Anything else you'd like to share, Mike? Or actually, before I do that, I just want to remind everyone, if you wouldn't mind, please, to keep your phones muted. If you have questions, we want to hear them. Comments, certainly. But if you wouldn't mind texting me or in the chat feature of the GoToMeeting, just alerting my attention. I'll keep a close eye on that, and then I will butt in and interrupt Mike accordingly, so Mike can just keep his focus on the actual material itself. So if that works for everyone, that we can clip along at the most we can in the most expeditious fashion, I guess. So unless there is any other questions with regards to governance and etiquette here on the GoToMeeting, I'll hand over the reins to you, Mike, and you can get started.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon, 4 minutes into the afternoon, or good morning for those of you in other time zones behind Washington or Atlanta. As Daniel said, my name is Mike Burke. I'm a partner with the law firm of Arnold Gold & Gregory. We have a long-standing relationship with Venza Group, both on PCI compliance, but also on some of the human resources compliance programs and efforts that Venza Group does for the hospitality market, specifically hotel. Well, that's. I think if there's a way to isolate whoever put us on hold, that would be great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Phones on mute.
Yeah, folks, sorry. I've been on calls before. It's probably hard for me to talk over that.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's gone. Okay, good. Yeah. So just to reiterate Daniel's earlier point, if you could put your phone on mute, that would be great. If you please don't put us on hold, because oftentimes we will get whatever hold music you have. Either at work or if you have hold music on your mobile phone, that'd be great. But as Daniel said, AGG is a partner with Venza Group on both PCI and human resources compliance strategies for the hospitality, specifically for the hotels industry. And we, obviously time for an update on the payment card industry data security standards, and looking at the title of our program. The look ahead has kind of already happened as of yesterday. PCI DSS, or the data security standard, is now at version 3.1, although parts of version 3.1, as we will discuss later on in this program, don't become effective for another 16 months. I'll skip ahead on that one. You know, lawyers often are accused of first delivering bad news, and unfortunately I'm going to keep to that reputation. And I don't want to overemphasize this too much, but I think you all have taken time out of your day for this call, and because you're concerned about the impact of data breaches on the information that you store, specifically cardholder data and related account information that you collect as part of your hotels or as part of your system's daily operations. I mean, if you think about it, hotels gather an incredible amount of data that is covered by the PCI data security standards. Everything from your back office reservations process to front desk to restaurants, spas, gift shops, etc. There online access through a TV or through the Wi-Fi connection that's often made available in hotel rooms. There's just a tremendous number of points at which a hotel collects and uses sensitive information. And in this case, since we're talking about PCI data security standards, it's information related to a cardholder's account number, etc. We'll get into that in a moment. But, you know, groups like Verizon and others who review data breaches consistently say, you know, hotels tend to be the single most vulnerable industry for data breaches. Again, that's driven because of the large amount of data you all collect and use, cardholder data that you collect and use, as well as, you know, they use the phrase low barriers to entry, which taken another way means frequent points of vulnerability in your data systems. About half of all data breaches involve the hotel or food service industries. The data that's been collected combines hotel and food services into a single industry, which makes it difficult to drill down into that number to determine whether it is more hotels or more food services. But that's what we have. 41% of preponderance of the breaches in the hotel industry are due to malicious attacks, everything from phishing to somebody sitting in your lobby or in a car outside of your hotel trying to get access to your system or otherwise. A third of the breaches are caused by what's termed employee negligence. We will get into that question in a moment when we talk about passwords and usernames and physical security issues that your hotels should consider implementing. And then 26% from system glitches, meaning a problem with the software or something like that. Again, we will get into that in a moment. The average breach, and average being the key word in that sentence, costs about $5.4 million to remediate. And that does not include about $3 million in lost revenue. Obviously, the more records that are compromised, the higher that number becomes, both in expenses as well as in lost revenue. Expenses, obviously, if there's a breach, the powers that be in the Payment Card Industry Council, the card brands will require you to conduct a thorough investigation of your systems. State law, you may have to notify victims of the breach, and then remediation, fixing the weakness that caused the breach, and potentially, and we'll discuss this in a moment, payment of fines or similar penalties to your card issuer, to the card brand. It's been my experience that PCI breaches are almost always treated as what lawyers would term a strict liability offense, in that nobody intends to go out and expose cardholder data for misuse. You all intend to keep that data secure and private, but it doesn't always work out that way. And my experience working in this area is that, notwithstanding anyone's intent to keep cardholder data secure, in the event of a breach, the card brands and others assume a strict liability posture, meaning that you very likely will be fined by these issuers in the event of a breach. You will be fined because you are considered to be merchants under the relevant PCI data security standard and under whatever processing or other agreements you may have with either Visa, MasterCard on the one hand, or your local bank. And local with banks is obviously a quaint term, but Bank of America, for example, or someone else. So you're going to find that you're on the hook for PCI compliance just because you accept debit and credit cards for payment. One thing to keep in mind is that the PCI compliance is in addition to any other statutory compliance that you may have. Again, my experience with working with PCI-related data breaches is that you often have to manage, in the event of a breach, a concurrent investigation between Visa, MasterCard, the card brands on the one hand, and the Federal Trade Commission on the other. And in some cases, there's a third investigation thrown in if a state consumer protection agency gets involved. Being subject and potentially penalized because of a breach of the PCI data security standards does not preclude you from being penalized under the Federal Trade Commission Act or any state statute. So the other way to put this is PCI compliance as an investment not only saves you exposures to Visa, MasterCard, or the other card brands, but also saves you exposures to the Federal Trade Commission or their state cohorts around the country. This, as you may know, and I'm probably covering well-known ground at this point for some of you, your compliance obligations as a merchant depend on your level, and that level is defined by the number of credit or debit card transactions that your hotel or your system does in a given year. The difference in levels triggers different compliance requirements, generally related to how often you do a network scan, who conducts that network scan, whether it can be done in-house or whether you have to have a qualified third party do it, as well as the frequency and the content of the attestations that you must make to the card issuer or to the card brand. So, and again, we'll get into that as well. Again, strict liability, and the single key item that I'd want to leave with you all today is that a proactive compliance posture, getting out in front of this issue and attacking it with an aggressive compliance program is key. And within that aggressive compliance program, I would say that training, taking seminars like this, looking at an integrated training approach such as the Venza Group offers, is a way to a way to go to make sure that your hotel, your brand, is not put on the front page of a newspaper, and you have to deal with remediating a breach. I grew up in a time when the Douglas Adams books were very popular. I think they remain popular, but one thing I would stress is that you should not panic. Don't panic about PCI compliance. It can be managed. Standalone hotels face the same compliance obligations as large, what I would term, and I'm probably using this term inaccurately, but hotel brands or hotel systems. And there's a wrinkle in there because I know that many systems use a franchise model. We'll address that a little later on, but just keep in mind that compliance, PCI compliance, is not the responsibility of one group of employees or one group of management in your hotel or in your system. It's the response is a shared responsibility of all parties. And again, the first step in compliance is training. Just by way of background, the data security standards are developed and issued by the Payment Card Industry Council. That is made up of JCB, Amex, Visa, MasterCard, the card issuers, the card brands, set the rules for data security as to the cardholder data that is part of what they market to consumers. Standard includes, there are 12 lead requirements, but if you've ever read through the data security standard, you'll know that within each of the 12 specific requirements, there can be 10 or so sub-requirements. It's a lot to digest, and what you want to keep in mind is it's often impossible for any company, any hotel, any merchant that is subject to PCI compliance to flip a switch and be compliant, fully compliant overnight. In some ways, you need to prioritize how you approach compliance by looking at what your weaknesses are and remedying those first. Again, none of you, I would assume, as merchants, have signed on explicitly to comply with the PCI data security standards. Your contract is not with the PCI Council. Your contract is with the issuer, the card brand, etc. And it's in those merchant agreements or similar contracts where your hotels, your properties are going to be expected to comply with the relevant PCI standard. Now, I think we've taken that, Daniel. Well, I would suggest that you've got external and internal compliance issues. The external ones, in some ways, are going to be your first step, determining whether you are a level 2 or a level 1 or perhaps even a level 3 merchant. Again, just based on the number of debit and credit card transactions that you process across all of your channels. So not just with your front desk or your spa or your restaurants taken individually, but all of them taken together, including your website. If you take online reservations or online payments, that counts when they say across all channels. There are some slight differences in how each card brand defines the levels, and the differences relate primarily to the number of transactions. On this slide, I've used Visa to distinguish between level 2 and level 1. Again, the difference is that at level 2, between 1 and 6 million transactions a year, you have to have a quarterly scan by an approved vendor and file an annual attestation, but one benefit is that you could have a designated qualified staff person perform the annual self-assessment for PCI compliance for your property, for your system, for your hotel. At level 1, which is over 6 million transactions, and that's, again, the biggest of the big, you need to have the annual assessment. You can't do it in-house. You have to have a qualified third party do the assessment. Internal compliance. Once you determine what your level is and what your kind of big picture external compliance obligations are, you need to develop an integrated compliance program that protects cardholder data. It's, I don't want to say odd, but it is an interesting thing that the compliance program, the development of the compliance program, is left to requirement 12 of the most recent, the 3.0 version of PCI, the PCI data security standard. In some ways, it should be the first thing that you do, developing the program and having a policy and set of procedures in place, not just to ensure the integrity and security of cardholder data, but to lay out what you're going to do periodically throughout a given year to test and to verify and to be secure in your knowledge that your systems and their integrity are what they should be. Training, again, and I know I'm going to be harping on this, training is key. You can eliminate, or you're not going to be able to eliminate totally the risk of a PCI breach, but with proper training, you can cut down on employee mistakes. You can empower your employees to ask questions, which can be a good way to catch those who would deliberately try to compromise your systems. But be judicious and be specific about who you train and how you train. You don't need to train every single employee at every single property you may have, but I would argue that there is a level of training that should be done with those people who either handle cards on a fairly regular basis, and that would be, for example, front office, front desk personnel, personnel who work at your restaurants, anybody who would run a card through and have or otherwise have access to what is defined as the cardholder data environment. So your IT people, your hotel management as well. It's an integrated approach, and not training your front desk staff, for example, leaves you with a weakness. Done properly, the training across, say management, the IT personnel, and front desk staff the training can support one another. And again, the tone from the top. This is also a crucial issue. The tone from the top, the tone from not just hotel management, but if you're in a hotel system, even if you're if you operate a franchise model, the expectation has to be, it has to be communicated frequently, that senior management of your system, of your hotel, of your franchise expects strict compliance with PCI data security standards. If any employee senses that commitment is not 100%, they won't treat it as 100%, and that leaves you with a possible weakness. I wanted to talk, and I think, Daniel, we may have skipped. I know that there were some questions about. I've been talking about 3.0, and in fact, it's now up to 3.1 as of yesterday. Just a very quick comment on that before I dive into some specific ideas on PCI compliance more generally. version 3.1 was released yesterday. It's unusual for PCI, the industry, to issue with an out-of-cycle update. Generally, PCI version 4.0 would have been expected at some point in 2017, but the council felt that the weakness, specifically what's the acronym is POODLE, the weakness in Secure Sockets Layer 3.0, as well as earlier versions of TLS, necessitated an update to PCI to be 3.1 to tell merchants that they need that SSL 3.0 and earlier versions, as well as versions 1.0 and in some cases 1.1 of TLS are no longer considered strong cryptography, and hotels, specifically, maybe not specifically hotels, but all merchants, and I think it's especially true for hotels, are going to have to immediately create a risk mitigation and migration plan. Updating and upgrading your encryption is going to be step one. This impacts three specific PCI requirements, 2.2.3, 2.3, and 4.1. But you do have a little bit of time, despite the fact that you need to begin your mitigation and migration strategy now. You have until June 30th of 2016 in order to comply, meaning that you have to have in place encryption, strong encryption that is not SSL 3.0 or younger, or TLS 1.0 or 1.1. One nuance to that rule, to the general rule that is behind version 3.1, relates to point-of-sale devices. You don't have to update your point-of-sale device if, and I would say if and only if, those point-of-sale devices have been verified as not being vulnerable to all known points of exposure for Secure Sockets Layer or TLS. So if you know that your point-of-sale devices are not vulnerable to POODLE or to any other known vulnerability, you can keep them in place past that June 30th, 2016 deadline. So the short answer, the short point is, upgrade your encryption. You may need to reconfigure it and disable SSL 3.0, but and related to that, as you make these significant changes to your cardholder data environment, you may need to perform out-of-cycle penetration testing and vulnerability scanning just to make sure that you have implemented the changes required by 3.1 effectively. So other tips on PCI compliance, as I said before, the data security standard has 12 main requirements that are made up of numerous sub-requirements. Rather than matching up and going through requirement by requirement, I just wanted to share some tips based on what I've seen in my practice as common vulnerabilities for hotels and other merchants under PCI, under the PCI data security standards. One is, prioritizing your effort. You're going to have to comply with each part of PCI data security standard, but your effort and spend will depend on what parts of your system are most vulnerable. And prioritizing based on vulnerabilities and length of time to remediation or solution is a good idea. That will help you, help your hotels, help your properties comply more effectively. If I've seen merchants try to implement all 12 requirements and various and sundry sub-requirements at the same time, in essence trying to flip a switch. It's a laudable effort, but it is something that can be extraordinarily time-consuming, more time-consuming than perhaps it should be, frustrating, and in the end, ineffective. So if you prioritize your vulnerabilities and match them up against what your PCI DSS requirements are, you will have a more effective rollout of your compliance strategy. I mentioned before that requirement 12 talks about developing an information security policy. This webinar, you're getting on your way to satisfying requirement 12. In some instances, requirement 12 should have been requirement 1, because your compliance effort, not just on the implementation side, but your ongoing compliance effort, should be based on a robust information security policy that not only contemplates specific issues under PCI data security standards, but also under what, if you have a state or federal law, or the law of jurisdictions other than the United States, as well as what may be termed consumer best practices. So I'll but I'll kind of gloss over some of this. I want to get more to the meat of the presentation, but up until yesterday, PCI 3.0 was the current version of the PCI data security standard, effective as of, I think that should actually be January 1, 2014, with some elements of version 3.0, and we'll get into that, that are effective this upcoming July. Some of the big changes from version 2.0 to 3.0 relate to requiring both a current diagram and an inventory of system components, kind of a rolling or ongoing requirement for evaluating malware threats, because that is a fast-moving area, and you can't rely on what may have worked a few months ago to properly evaluate malware threats. Ensuring that your antivirus and firewall and changelog settings, for example, can't be disabled or altered by any given user. Really, that is to guard against a rogue employee or a rogue manager doing something that will harm the integrity of your cardholder data environment. One of the things, again, and we're starting to get in some of the things that are will be effective as of July 1st. You may be dealing with these right now, but to the extent you develop your own software, having your software engineers understand and implement coding practices that will protect the cardholder data environment through that piece of bespoke software from the risks attendant in broken authentication or session management issues. If you have third-party service providers, again, this is effective as of July 1, you need to ensure that if those third-party service providers have remote access to your cardholder data environment, that each service provider has a unique authentication credential. And then there's a range of physical security authentication that's required, such as key cards for your server rooms, properly verifying those who purport to be from the phone company, quote unquote, or otherwise may try to get access to your to the physical components that make up your cardholder data environment. you want to make sure, again, effective July 1, that you visually check on a periodic basis your point of sale and other devices that capture payment card data. This relates, and I worked on this issue for a large U.S. retailer a couple years ago. The truth is, for point of sale terminals, they can be breached. There was a particular vulnerability in an earlier edition, about 3 or 4 years ago, of a POS terminal where a BlackBerry device, back when there were still BlackBerry devices, a BlackBerry device could be inserted into the casing of a point-of-sale terminal that would then capture every piece of data that flowed through that terminal. Notwithstanding the fact that vulnerability should have been disclosed to merchants but wasn't, the PCI Data Security Council decided that part of the answer, part of the reply on that particular issue would be a periodic visual inspection. So, train your personnel. If something looks odd or off about a point-of-sale terminal, for example, take it offline and examine it. Make sure that there's nothing in there that can compromise your cardholder data environment. And again, I spoke earlier about authenticating those who have the ability to change or add or delete an audit log or anything else.
Hey, Mike, Daniel here.
Yes.
We got a question from
Yeah.
Rick. And similar on that point that you were just mentioning, but the slide prior, you had referenced the authentication. Each service provider needs to have their own credentials. Rick was wondering, does this mean the employee of each service provider or the service provider as a whole?
The way it's written is it's the service provider as a whole. However, and I would add this, however, I would suggest that it is more effective if there's going to be more than one service provider employee with access. You probably should have unique authentication credentials for each such employee, because if there is a problem, and as lawyers we're trained to look at the if there is a problem question, but if there is a breach, you would need to be able to specifically identify the point of breach, and meaning that if it does turn out to be a weakness that is exposed by a third-party service provider having access, you want to make sure that you want to be able to trace it if you need to a specific employee. So I don't intend that answer to be contradictory, but I just wanted to highlight what might be a difference between what PCI is requiring and what they may end up requiring at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
Sure.
Question, Rick.
So I just want to, again, talk about some tips. There's some common mistakes for hotels that expose the cardholder data environment to breach. A lot of, most of the issues that hotels face are due to deliberate malicious conduct. One of the issues, and this is an issue that is more common than you might realize, but hotels, and this is true for merchants across the board, so please don't think I'm singling out hotels for criticism on this, but merchants often don't have a good idea about how their data environment is structured. They don't know where the points of access are. They don't know where the weak points are. That gets back to the earlier point about mapping out your cardholder data environment and identifying not just the access points, but potential weak points. You should, not just because it's required by the PCI DSS, but because it's a good idea, you should map your system and update that map or that schematic every 6 months, or whenever a new component is added to the data environment. And by a new component, it can be a new piece of software, it can be physically a new server, a new firewall, whatever it is. If there's something new that's added to the cardholder data environment, and if it's added before that 6-month time is done, you should update your map at the point of update. At the point of modification. Don't wait every 6 months. Do it at least every 6 months, or if more common or more frequent, whenever a new component is added. And knowing that map, knowing your weak points, will do a huge service to your compliance efforts. PCI DSS talks a lot about firewall and router configurations. Again, part of this gets back to the mapping, but you want to have a hard and fast DMZ between any public or untrusted network access and your cardholder data. Your firewall should be configured to only permit authorized traffic, meaning people who need to have access to the cardholder data environment because of their jobs. And again, you should narrowly construe that in your operations. One issue is bring your own devices. We all have devices. I access my work email through my own iPhone. I would venture that your hotels have employees who do the same thing. As part of your bring your own device policy, you must require those employees to install and use personal firewall software to make sure that remote access doesn't end up being a vulnerability point for your cardholder data environment. Passwords. This does relate back to firewalls and routers, but also looks forward to your employees. As soon as something is installed on your network, disable the default accounts. Get rid of them. I can't tell you how many times a merchant has had a breach and it's discovered that a default account was left untouched, enabling a thief to access the cardholder data environment. You don't want to be, you don't want to have the username and password be admin, admin1, admin1. Just change it and disable it. And really have configuration standards that are relevant for your operation. If there's vulnerability on newly installed components that you don't need, remove them. Drivers, subsystems, etc. Only put into your cardholder data environment the components and functionality that you need. If there's something that's installed that you don't need and don't use, that can evolve into a point of weakness. Require strong passwords that are changed periodically. Don't require each of your employees to have a username password combo that they don't share. There was an issue with the hotel about a year ago where it was discovered that the front desk personnel were using the same username and password, and it was discovered, and lo and behold, there was a breach. So don't, and train your personnel that they, if someone, there's always going to be the temptation. If somebody gets to work, they get to the front desk, they've forgotten their password, to look over at a colleague and say, hey, can I, what's the password? Can I borrow your password? Just don't allow it. No good can come from that. Using strong cryptography, we spoke earlier about version 3.1. Just understand that from and after the end of June of 2016, strong cryptography does not include SSL 3.1 or early versions of TLS. Your policy should, lock out If there are multiple failed attempts to log on because of a username password issue, lock it out. Lock out that, until it can be reset. I would say knowingly reset. Understand, as part of your mapping, understand what you collect in terms of cardholder information and where you put it. Oftentimes, again, getting back to this merchant, I worked with the merchant retailer from a couple of years ago. They did not realize that they were inadvertently storing cardholder data information for months, past the point they needed it. You should have a system in place that you delete that information when it's no longer needed. Keeping cardholder data in your systems longer than required, again, huge risk point. Never, an authentication data, never store it. Just, use it and get rid of it. Encryption, not to put too fine a point on version 3.1, but if there's any transmissions across public networks, they should be strong. Use strong encryption. Antivirus software. I would say this is not just antivirus software, but any system software. Keep them up to date. There was an issue, again, I think it was within the past year, with another retailer where they had not updated their antivirus or anti-malware software and were breached by, they had a breach because of that. It was discovered that thieves got into their cardholder data environment using an attack that, had they properly and timely upgraded or updated, their anti-malware software would not have happened. And again, using periodic scans to identify potential virus malware weaknesses and documenting the results of those scans are crucial. The earlier point about restricting the ability of specific people to access or alter logs or router settings also applies to settings and other items related to antivirus software. The earlier point about ranking your vulnerabilities, that's, identify and protect your assets. Rank your vulnerabilities and implement, robust change control procedures. We spoke earlier about how to, training, to the extent you have in-house software development, ensure that your coders understand how to avoid, the SQL injection vulnerability, for example, common ones, and that they understand and that they properly explain to you how sensitive data would be handled in memory. So how is their software going to interact with sensitive data? And again, because of the change from 2.0 to 3.0, and this was not changed in the upgrade to 3.1, you need to implement broken authentication and session management protections after June 30th of this year. Again, restrict access, and this means not just virtual access, but physical access. Only those of your employees who need to know or need to have access to the data, cardholder data environment because of their jobs should have that access. Not every, that is a very small group within your hotel. And the way, one common way to police that is through robust usernames and passwords, strong passwords specifically. You should have what's called a deny all posture, meaning that your default posture should be that nobody has access to the cardholder data environment unless they can justify it as part of as being necessary for their jobs.
Got a question. Yeah. We have a question from Ben. The question reads, both Mandarin and White Lodging recently announced breaches that were a result
Yep.
of malware-infected systems that exposed cardholder data for several months. Do you happen to know what type of malware was used on those attacks?
Not in the, well, not offhand. I do, but I have it written down someplace. I think it may have been a variant of an SQL injection issue, but I think that's a good point where they, the breach went on for a pretty long period of time, which suggests both that the, maybe it was malware that couldn't have been addressed by an upgrade, but maybe it could have been. And the other point is, if it lasts for a couple months, it suggests that the hotels were not scanning their cardholder data environment for vulnerabilities. So, in that case, the point would be not just the guarding against specific malware attacks, but also the follow-on issue of not identifying in a timely way not just the risk, but if you've been breached. So that's kind of a long answer to a pretty simple question, so my apologies.
Well, if we get a specific malware, then perhaps we can send it as part of a follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So we'll be sending the video link to this webinar after as well, and so I can put that extra that additional information in that link for all the attendees.
Yeah. I think, just very quickly on a couple of weakness areas, you should have somebody, perhaps it's your IT department, sweep the hotel. In the sense of, there's been at least one case that we know of, and there may be more, and one of the challenges we have in this area is sometimes we're not aware or made aware of what a specific malware or specific approach may have been to breach cardholder data environment at a given place, because the council doesn't want to encourage copycats. They don't want to get out that something worked, and then if you know what then you're going to get copycats. But we do know, for example, that somebody. This was not at a hotel. This was at a retailer. Left behind one of those Apple routers, and was able to access that in the parking lot of the hotel of the store, which then helped them gain access to the cardholder data environment in the store. So it's not just folks that are attacking you from 1,000 miles away. It can be someone who places something in your hotel. So, a visual sweep periodically is a good idea. Again, permissions about access conditions. You should require more than one approval to change it. This guards against the rogue employee to some extent. It's not a cure-all. It's not 100% protection, but it will give you some measure of protection and also some measure of defense should there be an issue. If somebody quits or is terminated, revoke their account immediately. You'd be surprised how often a breach happens because a hacker is able to gain access through a terminated employee's account information. Whether or not that there's cooperation between the terminated employee and the hacker is not always necessary, but it's an unneeded vulnerability that you can easily remedy. We talked about reauthentication. A lot of this you're probably already doing. Locking out the ID after a number of unsuccessful attempts, two-factor authentication for remote access. Don't use generic or group IDs. Make sure they're specific to the employee. Facility controls and physical access. You want to guard against somebody presenting themselves to your front desk or to your manager saying, oh, I'm here from the phone company and I need to take a look at your servers, or I'm here from the cable company, or I'm here from whoever. That happens. Unrestricted access, where physical access where it's not totally verified, can lead to malware being loaded directly onto your system, or worse. So, you just want to have a visitor control policy where you have a high degree of certainty that a person who says that they're from the phone company, for example, that they're actually from the phone company. And then again, the point about visual inspections. Tracking and testing, these are related issues. Audit trails, you want to understand who and how may be changing router configurations, firewalls, etc., password, what have you. You just want to be able to trace that effort to a specific user, and you want to make sure that these audit trails are secured from alteration, because people, hackers, where there's a conspiracy, there's always going to be a desire to alter an audit trail. Keep those records for a year, and periodically, don't just keep them, but review them to make sure you don't see something that looks odd. For testing, you want to sweep quarterly for on-off, and this, I think this goes hand in hand with the visual sweep, but also, test quarterly for unauthorized wireless access points. Do your vulnerability scanning quarterly. Penetration testing is required from and after June 30th. And change detection mechanisms. That gets back to the point about tracking access. If somebody is going to make material change to your cardholder data environment or to a component or system therein, you need to understand. It needs to be detected and either approved or rejected depending on what may be going on. And then again, look, the compliance program, we started with that, and it's a useful point to end on. Your compliance program is what is going to set you apart. It really is an investment in protecting your brand, the value of your brand. I would argue that certain retailers that have had breaches, they don't like seeing themselves in the newspaper. They get a negative, there's a negative connotation associated with those retailers. Their brand is damaged. So this compliance effort, not just on PCI, but I would say PCI specifically, but perhaps more broadly on all information security, is an investment in protecting your hotel's brand, your systems, your franchise's brand. And that is, that involves training. It involves programs like this, the ongoing training that Venza offers, through the PEAK system. Have a specific person in your organization responsible for the PCI compliance effort. I said a specific person. It could be a team. Maybe, if you have multiple properties, you've got someone at each property who is responsible for that property. It doesn't need to be a specific job, but it does need to be done. And one other point, we were talking about the service provider issue. I just recapped that because that is an area where merchants are having a lot of questions that if you have a service provider, in this scenario you would be the customer, you want those service providers to acknowledge to you in writing that if they somehow get access to the cardholder data environment, that you properly paper it, that you get a proper written acknowledgement from that service provider that they understand and will protect the integrity and security of the cardholder data environment. So I think with that, yeah, that's come to the end of the presentation. My contact information is there. I know that you guys likely have contact information for Daniel, and perhaps Jeff, but I know that, as Daniel said, we will send out additional information as part of the follow-up to this webinar. And I think with that, Daniel, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I know, if I'm remembering correctly, we're right up on that time limit, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions there may be.
Yeah, fantastic stuff, Mike. I actually have a question with regards to that very last bullet point. What's the typical, what is that document, what format in terms of a legal document, what would be the format?
The best place to put that, frankly, is going to be in whatever service agreement that the hotel, as a customer, would execute with the service provider. I don't know that it needs to be a standalone document. I mean, if it's
part of the SLA or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, if you don't have one, you should get a standalone. You know, if you know you get close to that June 30th date and you have a bunch of service agreements with providers that don't include that kind of an acknowledgement, then I would say that you could probably do a quick one-pager for them. You want to have it in place. You want to keep your records in place because, again, looking forward and keeping your fingers crossed that there is no breach or related issue, but in the event there is, that you have the right paperwork to show Visa or whoever it may be that may be asking questions.
Right. I'm going to take things off mute, people off mute. If you have any questions for Mike, just maybe put your name in the chat and I'll call on you. As we're wrapping up, again, this entire webinar will be it has been recorded and will be posted, just like all of our hospitality webinar series installments on our video library. So I will send that link to everyone once that is posted, as well as some of that information once we scare up the details around that malware that was used for white lodging, and yeah. So as Mike had said, he's there. It looks like Marion's got a question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Mike. Thank you very much. Very informative. Could you talk to us at all about chaining?
I can, but not in not in a
vague manner. Okay.
Yeah, and probably not with. I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah.
Well, how about, can you define what you interpret chaining, how you view it in a definition, and what things are on the horizon, maybe quickly?
Yeah. I actually have a memo on this. Where did I put it? Shoot. Sorry. Yeah, I'm trying to look it up. Not look chaining up, but I had a memo on this that I thought was pretty good. If you could bear with me for just a minute. So chaining, as I would define it, earlier I talked about franchise, and I understand that many hotels operate as franchises, meaning you don't directly own each property. And so then the question becomes, if you've got different legal entities seeing cardholder data, so say a reservation comes into a hotel's central office and then is farmed out to a franchisee, or it can flow the other way also. What's the extent of the shared compliance responsibility? can the actions or inactions or negligence, I guess, of one of the other parties affect the other one? My sense, and this is a hugely might be the wrong word. This is a controversial issue because what we're seeing in PCI type compliance questions differs from kind of the traditional legal risk sharing that you might see in a franchise relationship. Meaning that for most legal issues, you don't get chaining, meaning that the actions or inactions or issues created by a franchisee, for example, doesn't impact the franchisor. Because they're different legal entities, you've got that legal separation. I've seen a couple of investigations where they're chaining. The card issuers, the card brands are, in my view, are unduly conflating what a franchisee does with what its franchisor's responsibilities may be. It's becoming much more of what I term a shared responsibility, which is not good news in the sense of it creates a degree of complexity in PCI compliance, because then it suggests that the franchisor should scan franchisees' systems, which then gets into a separate legal issue, which is if they do so, are they then assuming non-PCI related liability for that scan? If there's a weakness that they didn't detect, or if there's a weakness they didn't notify to the franchisee. So it's one of these onions that I don't think that PCI folks are getting this right. I mean, in my view, that you do have a hard and fast legal separation between franchisor and franchisee. That being said, the trend is the other way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. In certain times you have brands that impose certain technology for reservations on the franchisee. For example, a cloud-based PMS or a system, they're moving to a CRS, and then they're opening up vulnerabilities because those computers may be connected to a variety of other systems that are not secure, and that's really rare.
I mean, and that, because the vulnerability points proliferate when that type of access, when that type of software is mandated by the franchisor. So I think it is in some ways also an issue that people are still trying to get their heads around, because it's the franchise. And I guess I'll stop with this point. The franchise business model was created was created on purpose, and it was one of those reasons was to separate legal responsibilities as between the franchisee and the franchisor. If you start conflating that, then you dramatically increase the compliance burden on, for example, a franchisor to make sure that their franchisee in some random place, is doing what they should be doing in terms of PCI compliance. And, for example, that if that franchisee hotel lets certain of its employees access a system remotely, that employee, that the franchisor is protected from that franchisee's employee's negligence or deliberate misconduct. So it's a slippery slope here.
Excellent, fantastic stuff there.
Thank you.
From start to finish with a lot of great content. Just PCI at large and in general, as well as some of the specifics of 3.0. So thank you, and now 3.1. So thank you, Mike. Unless we have any other questions. Oh, actually, one just came in. You're not off the hook just yet,
Okay.
Mike. Do you have time for one more?
Absolutely, yeah.
How would this be relevant in the context of doing business as DBA portion of the PCI DSS? So I guess this is in reference to your discussion on chaining. Yes.
Sorry, I missed the middle part of that question. How would that be relevant in terms of doing
context
business?
of doing business as DBA portion of PCI?
Oh yeah, I think it's similar. I mean, I think that, the DBA issue I view as somewhat similar to the chaining issue in the sense that if the hotel's DBAing, it's still going to end up, it's still the master entity that's got, or the core entity that's got the obligations. Not a great answer, but I think that's kind of where I come out on it.
Well, fantastic. Again, folks, this will all be posted to our video library. If you do have any questions where you're pursuing, you want some one-on-one time with Mike, there you go. He's sharing his contact information. Mike or any of his colleagues at AGG would be, I'm sure, thrilled to speak with you. If you have any questions around peak compliance and performance series programs, feel free to reach out to me at Venz Group. So without further ado, unless there are any other last-minute questions, I want to say thank you again, Mike. Incredible presentation. Lots of time you put into presenting this and preparing and presenting. So thank you so much for that, and thank you everyone for attending.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and thank you again, everyone, for being on the call.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.